Ukraine has hit a Russian oil rig in the Caspian Sea, a shadow fleet tanker in the Black Sea, and a chemical plant some 500 miles inside Kremlin territory, while a market in St. Petersburg has been engulfed by a mystery fire. But Russian forces continue to slog on relentlessly. Minograd near Pokrovsk is at risk of being encircled, and Siversk is in peril. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor of the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. In the Caspian Sea, Ukraine's SBU intelligence agency say they hit an oil rig with 4 drones overnight. That is the first time they've hit an oil production facility in the Caspian Sea, and it appears to represent a new front in their attempt to choke the Kremlin's coffers, to starve Russia of the money it needs to prosecute the war. That is what the campaign against oil refineries, oil production facilities, gas transshipment plants is all about. They say that the Vladimir Putin rig was hit, forcing production to be stopped across 20 wells that it serves. Together, they produce around 120,000 barrels of oil a day. That very roughly represents a little bit over 1% of Russian production. So on its own, is it going to dent the Kremlin's oil production? No. Is it the beginning of something new? Well, quite possibly yes. This was part of a massive overnight drone barrage launched by Ukraine at Russia. Moscow claiming it shot down some 287 drones. We saw strikes in Belgorod, but perhaps the most dramatic was the Akron chemical plant, producing fertilizer, but also producing chemicals which are used in explosives. Footage of huge fires erupting there. CCTV also appearing to show the plant on fire, fires out of control. We've also seen unusually clear footage from Sea Baby drones hitting an empty oil tanker in the Black Sea. This was the stateless Dashan vessel, or possibly a Comoros Islands flagged vessel, though some suggestions the flag it was flying was fake, and in fact this vessel was stateless. It's a 160,000 ton tanker, so that's how much oil it can carry, but it appeared to be unladen at the time of the attack. We could see that it was sitting high in the water, and at least 2 Sea Baby drones hit it either side at the stern of the vessel, just in front of the rudder. Marine experts suggesting these were very carefully placed strikes designed to flood the engine room, to cripple the vessel, but to not to sink it, and to not create a massive oil leak into the Black Sea. That is just the latest in what appears to be a growing campaign to target these shadow fleet vessels. The shadow fleet are often third country flagged vessels, many of which have been sanctioned because they are trying to help Russia evade the sanctions on the exports of its hydrocarbons. We saw within the last 2 or 3 weeks the Kairos and the Virat tankers both hit in the Black Sea. There's also been the Mersin, which was struck off the coast of Dakar, it's Senegal, in West Africa. Now, Ukraine did not claim responsibility for that, but all of those vessels I've mentioned have either been sanctioned and have been linked to this illicit trade in Russian oil and gas. There are, though, around 500, perhaps more than 500 vessels in the Russian shadow fleet. So just like hitting that oil rig might dent 1% of Russia's oil production, so hitting these vessels so far may only represent a small dent in the capabilities, the capacity of the shadow fleet. But it's interesting because those ship owners, when they realise that their vessels are now being targeted, may think twice. These are expensive vessels, worth many tens of millions of dollars. Their cargoes often worth double or triple the value of the ship. But nonetheless, those ships' owners may think twice about allowing them to be used for this kind of trade if they're being hit. How has Russia responded? Well, as always, devastating response. We've seen around 1,600 missiles and drones fired at Ukraine this week. The last few days, those strikes have been smaller, but earlier on in the week, we saw one night with some 700 fired. And that's often a tactic we see again and again focusing the strikes because that allows Russia to try and overwhelm the available air defences. And in the close fight, the maps showing Ukrainian forces in Minograd, that's an industrial area just to the northeast of Pokrovsk, looking increasingly encircled. And troops have explained, some of the soldiers there have been giving interviews explaining how the only way in and out of their positions is what's referred to as the grey zone, that is the contested area. One Marine saying that every time that they can only really get in very, very rarely, makes resupplies incredibly difficult, makes rotations of troops incredibly difficult. And when they try and move in vehicles, all of those vehicles get hit. So the only way in and out is on foot. And that makes it really hard for the soldiers to get supplied with food and water and ammunition. It makes it really hard for them to evacuate their wounded. So potentially horrific conditions for those soldiers holding out there. Interestingly, in nearby Pokrovsk, General Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, has claimed that his forces have now retaken some positions in the city, but in the same breath as he announced that, he admitted that they had withdrawn from the city earlier in the autumn. And that's interesting, as we were reporting that here on Frontline, but many sort of, I'd say, slightly breathless Ukrainian reports, social media accounts suggesting that that was nonsense, that they'd never left those positions. Fighting very, very fierce. Further north in Donetsk, in Seversk, there appears to have been rapid Russian advances to the east of the city and into the city. And just this morning, before we started recording, we saw what appeared to be geolocated pictures of Russian soldiers holding up a flag on the tank monument outside the town. So many of these old Ukrainian towns have statues of World War II soldiers or tanks as monuments or fighter jets. And Seversk, no different, has a tank on the outskirts of the town, which the Russians have now reached. On the diplomatic front, it's been pretty tumultuous again, although we're getting used to tumult in the diplomacy. President Zelensky said he is willing to hold elections if America is prepared to provide the security guarantees. This is quite an interesting feint or sort of counterpunch from Kyiv, because Donald Trump has been coming out with some extraordinary rants, extraordinary to those of us who expect a certain standard of diplomacy, I suppose less extraordinary if you've been watching Donald Trump since he came into office. He has accused Zelensky and Ukraine, it was Zelensky's government, of prolonging the war in order to stay in power. He's basically said that size will win, that Russia will win, that Zelensky has to sue for peace. And he also claimed that at one point that Zelensky hadn't read a peace deal. Zelensky's responded to that by saying that he's willing to hold elections if America provides the guarantees which are so important to Ukraine. These are the security guarantees. These are the promises, the sort of Article 5 style guarantees that if Russia attacks, that attack will be treated as an attack on the guarantors of that security. And Europe has talked about providing those guarantees, but clearly America is the nation with the most might, and it's America's guarantee that both Europe and Ukraine want to deter future Russian attacks. Interestingly, Keith Kellogg, who was the US envoy to Ukraine, although has been slightly supplanted ever since Trump came to power by Witkoff, by Kushner, and others, he said he thought peace was close. There were two outstanding issues that needed to be resolved. That was the status of the Donbass, suggestions of ceding territory, Ukraine giving up territory for the sake of peace. Because suggestions of land swaps, I think, are misleading. It's not really a swap. There's no swapping going on. It's about ceding. Russia and America appear to want Ukraine to cede areas of the Donbass that Russia has been unable to take by force. Kellogg said the other area of contention was the status of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power station in Europe, and over who would control that. One other thing to talk about today, Ukraine's prosecutor's office has decided to stop publishing statistics on desertion. And that's very interesting, because they have said the reason they're doing that is because those statistics can be detrimental, can be used against Ukraine, because actually huge numbers of people have either gone AWOL or have deserted, or at least the prosecutors have opened huge numbers of cases for people accused of doing these things. Nearly 300,000 cases since the start of the war. Interestingly, around 2/3 of those are in the last year. So up to the end of 2024, there are around 90,000 cases. Up to this autumn, that increased to about 290,000 cases. those statistics, we're no longer going to see them. That reflects on the huge manpower crisis that Ukraine is having. Many of the soldiers who are fighting have been fighting in one way or another since 2014. A lot of the others volunteered immediately at the start of the war in 2022. They are exhausted. The ones who've survived this long are utterly exhausted. Many of them in positions like Minograd where they cannot rotate, they cannot get properly rested. And even if they could, there aren't enough soldiers in the rear to rotate with them to give them that proper rest and recuperation that soldiers need. At the same time, there's a chronic shortage of volunteers willing to take their place. So all of this speaks to a manpower shortage, a manpower crisis, I would say, that Ukraine is facing. I make no bones about the fact we want Ukraine to win this war, but we are clear-eyed about the challenges that Ukraine is facing. I don't think there's any value on Frontline of us sugarcoating those problems. Also on the diplomatic front, slightly away from Ukraine, but worth mentioning, there's reports that America, as part of its national security strategy and sort of classified annex, has suggested creating a new group of nations, something to rival the G7. This is the Core 5, it's referred to, the C5, that would effectively involve America, China, India, Russia. A new power group, and that clearly has the old world, if you like, European powers deeply concerned about America's pivoting away from those old historic allegiances. If you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We had loads of comments and thank you all so much for the positive, for the support, for the encouragement. It's really good to read that, and I do try and reply to as many as possible. Question number 1. China appears to be selling drones to both sides. That's odd. I'd say it's not odd. I'd say that's as old as war is war profiteering, and the opportunity, if there is a merchant to sell weapons to both sides of a conflict, is unfortunately good, perhaps slightly evil and immoral, but good business nonetheless. A lot of questions on Euroclear. That's the Belgian company that holds that 185 billion euros worth of Russian assets. Why does Belgium want the money? Well, having that amount of wealth in a private company in Belgium obviously generates a lot of wealth. Having wealth generates wealth. The company itself, very, very powerful. So why can't they just take it? Well, it's complicated, but fundamentally, it's about setting a precedent. If you seize the assets of a state when they're in your country, then people from that state will be very reluctant to invest in future. And in fact, you might immediately trigger an exodus of investments. So, for example, other wealthy countries, for example, China, may choose to withdraw investments from European or Western nations. And that has some potentially massive knock-on effects to their economies. And the final question on this is, what court in the world would Russia win that lawsuit? It's a good question, and there are lots of really clever lawyers trying to work out ways of using this money in a mechanism that is legal, because fundamentally what Europe would maintain and Ukraine's allies would maintain is they are fighting to uphold the rule of law. And whilst Russia has launched an illegal war of aggression against its neighbour, and whilst this would be a response to that, it is a legally grey area over who is responsible, who owns the money, how they can be taken. I might not be explaining that as clearly as I possibly can. It's worth, if you're interested in it, it is worth reading up on exactly how Euroclear operates and how many of the other countries in Europe are trying to find legal remedies to reassure Belgium that they can use the money. Quick question, does anybody trust Donald Trump? A lot of you were leaving comments aghast at his behaviour, very supportive of Ukraine. Do people trust him? I think the short answer is no. Outside his core group of supporters in America and his core loyalists, I would say sort of internationally, countries that have to deal with him, they may respect him, they may respect the power he wields, but I think he is certainly a pretty slippery character, and therefore hard to place any trust in that he's going to be constant in any of his positions, ideological or policy positions. Finally, could Ukraine send drones to the Baltic? In theory, absolutely, yes, they can. Why is that relevant? Because the Shadow Fleet, Russia's Shadow Fleet, transit through the Baltic. How do we know they can do it? Well, because Ukraine has shown extraordinary reach and ability to operate all over the world when it wants to. Why would they do it? Well, they have to match their priorities against their resources. They have limited resources and they have some very high priorities. And at the moment, those priorities appear to be focused on the Black Sea, but I certainly don't think it's out of the question. If they wanted to target Shadow Fleet vessels in the Baltic, then I think they could. Thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, do ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time.